Art and Architecture of Coexistence, Past and Present. A panel discussion organized by the Islamic Art Society on the role of art and architecture in promoting interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and tolerance. Throughout history, art and architecture has been a window into the lives and times of people. It has captured their triumphs and tribulations and has helped them express their emotions and feelings. People of diverse backgrounds have shared common art themes, adapted artistic art forms from each other, and have coexisted in the space of art for centuries. Our panel of expert art historians come together to discuss how art and architecture can promote harmony and coexistence in our world today. Please join Dr. Farshid Emami, Rice University, Dr. Luis Markos from Houston Baptist University, Dr. Diane Wolfthal from Rice University, and Azra Aksamija from MIT to find how followers of different faiths can come together through art to understand each other and live in peace and harmony.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Islamic Art Society program dedicated to the art and architecture of coexistence, past and present. My name is Farshid Emami and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Art History at Rice University. Our panel today consists of 4 presentations dedicated to the shared elements of Jewish and Muslim visual cultures, incarnation, sacrament, and the arts in Christianity, multiculturalism in medieval architecture, and the ways in which a sense of convergence among different communities can be cultivated through architecture in the present day. Through these presentations, we hope to highlight the potential of the arts for promoting interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and peace. Each of us will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and we will then have time to take some questions. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Luis Markos. Dr. Markos is a professor of English and a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, where he has taught for 30 years. He is the author of 20 books, including From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics, Heaven and Hell, Visions of the Afterlife in the Western Poetic Tradition, and The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. He is committed to the concept of a professor as public educator and believes that knowledge must not be walled up in the academy, but must be disseminated to all who have ears to hear. So with that, I now turn the podium to Professor Markos.
Thanks so much, Farshid, and hello, everyone. I want to give you a quick overview of Christianity and the arts. Now, like Islam and Judaism, Christianity does believe in the stricture against graven images. And yet in Christianity, we do have figural art, not only art of holy people, but art of Jesus and the saints and even of God the Father. And pretty early on in the church, I'm going to open this up here, pretty early on in the church, the earliest Christian art that we know of comes from the catacombs, where the Christians buried their dead. And luckily, a lot of those paintings still survive. And what's fascinating is because the Jewish Christians, the original Christians, of course, were Jewish, didn't really have a visual vocabulary to tell the stories of Jesus, because the Jews, again, did not make representations. They actually did turn to some of the pagan nations. And so here is a famous painting from the catacomb of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Well, a lot of us will recognize this image, but this image is actually based on Apollo. And Apollo was often shown with a sheep around his neck. And so they weren't being syncretistic. They weren't saying Jesus is Apollo, but they were trying to find a visual language to express the belief of Christianity. Here's another example here. This is Jesus as if he were Orpheus. If you know the story, Orpheus rescued his beloved Eurydice from hell by playing on his lyre and moving the heart of Hades to pity so that he could release her from hell. And so here we have Jesus as Orpheus, because Jesus is the one that rescued us from hell. Here is another early image that we see again and again in the early church. It's called the harrowing of hell. The belief that between Jesus's death on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter Sunday, he descended into hell, broke down the gates of hell, and rescued the righteous people of the Old Testament. So here we see Jesus, and he's standing on the gates of hell. The chains underneath here represent hell. And here he's reaching out to Adam and Eve and saving them and taking them up into heaven. Now, another thing they borrowed from the Greeks and Romans is a kind of iconography that allows you to identify people. So in the pagan religions, you know it's Athena if she has an owl perched on her. You know that it's Zeus if he's holding a thunderbolt. Well, here we know this is Moses because he's holding the Ten Commandments. We know these are David and Solomon because they're crowned as kings. We know that this is John the Baptist because he's wearing sackcloth, making him look rather like Elijah. And so what happened is early on in the church, they came up with a visual language to express the stories of the faith. Now, in this series, we are talking about the overlap between the Abrahamic faiths, and oftentimes that overlap was, more mutual, as we saw in Moorish Spain, or as we saw under Akbar and the Mughal Empire. But about 730 AD, about 100 years after the death of Muhammad, there was a lot of fighting between the Muslim armies and the armies of the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine began to lose, and they were not used to losing. Usually they were winning. They were basically the heirs of the Roman Empire, and they were used to victory. And as they lost, it caused what seems to have been a sort of crisis in faith. Were we Christians doing something wrong and God was mad at us? And one of the things that the people in the army wondered was, hey, this new religion of Islam, they're staying true to Judaism. They don't have any representation. They don't even have any representations of Muhammad, much less of God. And yet here we have all of these icons, all of these images. Maybe we're doing something wrong. And so starting about 730 AD and lasting for about 100 years, off and on, there was great strife in the Byzantine Empire. And we call this the strife over iconoclasm. Iconoclasm means literally breaking the icons. And a lot of the Byzantines went around and destroyed icons like the one you're seeing, other icons of Jesus, of Mary, of the saints, etc., wondering what happened. And again, this caused a crisis. And, sometimes different faiths help us to understand better what we do and don't believe. And after 100 years of conflict, the Byzantines decided that, yes, it was okay to have icons. And here's an example of the kind of icon you see in the Byzantine Empire. This, of course, is of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. But you ask yourself, why did they think they could do this? If Muslims could not show Muhammad and they believed him to be a man, then how could Christians who believed Jesus was God in human flesh, how could they possibly depict him? Well, if you want to learn about this, read a book by a man named John of Damascus. John of Damascus was the great theologian of icons and of Christian art. And what he determined, and this is central to Christianity, was the reason why Christians could now have figural representations, not only of the saints, but of the Virgin Mary and Christ, was because literally of the incarnation. The incarnation means that God became man. Jesus wasn't just a God wearing a man's suit. He was fully God and fully man. This is the incredible teaching of the incarnation. What did that mean? They decided what that meant was when God took on flesh and became a man in time and space, he baptized physical matter as a fit receptacle for divine meaning and presence. Let me say that again. When God became man, he baptized physical matter as a fit receptacle for divine meaning and divine presence. And by the way, if you go to the chat, I uploaded my one-page outline because I'm not going to be able to cover everything. I'm just giving you the highlights here. Now, what this meant was, yes, we could now depict these things because God in the incarnation lifted up the arts and allowed them to bear divine meaning without falling into idolatry. Though, as you can see by looking at this icon, and all Byzantine icons are similar, even to this day, you will see that they decided that although it was okay to depict these images, they still decided to make them otherworldly. You'll notice that all icons have this flat background. It's usually gold, sometimes it's blue, but it's usually gold, and they are flattening space, not because they're bad artists who don't know how to do perspective. They're flattening space because they're trying to express eternity, where time and space are flattened out. You'll also notice in all icons, although they are basically realistic, they are not overly realistic. Always the people are shown with elongated features like the nose here. The fingers are elongated. They're otherworldly. The eyes seem to be turned both inward and outward at the same time. And so we are depicting them in art, but we are also pointing away from the earth towards heaven. Now, in the West, in the Latin West, as opposed to the Greek East, they also went for figural representation that was not overly realistic. But unlike the Byzantines, the Latins in Western Europe, maybe because of the influence of Greece and Rome, whatever, but they started to allow a more three-dimensional rendering, something that's a little bit more realistic, a little bit more dramatic. Now, all of that changes around 1300. This is the High Renaissance, when the great artist Giotto made a revolution. Now, notice this picture of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. It's a fresco. Notice that it has a flat background. It's blue rather than gold. It also has, notice these outcroppings of rock. You always see that in icons depicting the life of Christ. So he's got images that are still like the two-dimensional icons, but he has infused them with an incredible realism, with a drama. Every one of these people and their reactions offers a different expression. Look at Lazarus. He literally looks like he's just come out of the tomb. And so Giotto begins something in the West that allows for a more dramatic and realistic rendering. Then the Renaissance comes in the 15th century, the early Renaissance, the 1400s. Here is Fra Angelico showing the Annunciation, when the Archangel Gabriel announced to Mary that she would give birth to Christ, the Son of God, while still a virgin. And notice how, again, the art is becoming even more realistic. It's becoming more three-dimensional. It is breaking into our world. And then, of course, the 16th century gives us the High Renaissance, the time of Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, all of the greats, right? And what they did is they not only continued the realistic portrayal, the drama, and all of that, they also found a way, to quote one of the sayings of my university, they tried to bring Athens and Jerusalem together. They tried to bring the Judeo-Christian legacy of Jerusalem together with the Greco-Roman legacy of Rome, which is basically what gave us the modern European and American university. And I'll show you here, you'll recognize this as the Sistine Chapel. And along the central panels here are the stories from Genesis 1 to 11, the stories of creation, fall, and the flood. But along here, it's too small, but you can find a bigger picture. But around these are all of the prophets of the Old Testament who prophesied the Messiah, Christ, but interspersed within them, these ladies here are actually the oracles and sibyls of ancient Greece and Rome. What are they doing here? These are pagan prophetesses. And yet in the High Renaissance, there is an attempt to embody in Christian art the best of the pre-Christian pagan legacy. Now, let me quickly end here because I'm out of time. As the Catholic Church got more and more developed in their art, this did bother some Christians. And so during the Protestant Reformation that started in the 16th century and really built up steam in the 17th century, amongst Protestants, we have a new outbreaking of iconoclasm. Not all of them, but particularly in England, there was a Puritan revolution led by Oliver Cromwell, and they started smashing the icons and images again. And I'll end by saying I'm an interesting person to give this speech because I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church and came to know Jesus as the Son of God there, but now I live in the Baptist evangelical world. And so I see both places. And I'll tell you, it's kind of funny that Houston Baptist University, where I teach, has one of the finest MFA programs in the country. That's odd. To have an artistic MFA program in a Baptist school is like having a major in wine tasting in a Muslim school or a business class on making money on the Sabbath in a Jewish school. I mean, this is kind of an odd thing, but we are trying, and as part of the dialogue that is going on here, HBU and the others that are here speaking are trying to reach out hands and find an art that will lift us up, not only making us more human, but draw us closer to God. Thanks again. And again, if you look in the chat, you'll see my outline if you want more notes.
Thank you, Professor Markos, for the enlightening presentation. Our next paper is by Professor Diane Wolfthal. Dr. Wolfthal is Professor Emerita in the Department of Art History at Rice University. She specializes in late medieval and early modern European art, and she is the author of numerous articles and books. Unfortunately, Professor Wolfthal is unable to attend the session today, but she has kindly sent us her paper. Ailish Coughlin, a PhD student in the Department of Art History at Rice University, will now present Professor Wolfthal's paper.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Professor Emami said, I'm reading this paper on behalf of Professor Diane Wolfthal, entitled Shared Visual Cultures, the Art of Medieval Jews and Muslims. And here I go. Medieval Jews and Muslims shared many ideas about imagery. This should not be surprising, since by the 9th century, 90% of Jewry lived in Islamic lands. Sometimes one group was influenced by the other. For example, Jews adopted from Muslims the idea of the codex, or book form from manuscripts. And Jews and Muslims also share the belief that representations of human and animal forms should be limited. A major motivation was their desire to avoid idolatry. For example, the second commandment reads in English, "You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." This suggests that only images made for worship are prohibited. Indeed, Jews and Muslims rarely commissioned large-scale figural sculpture. Similarly, although they often decorated their secular texts or buildings with figural images, they never adorned their holiest books or places with them. Here's a Jewish Bible from Fatimid Egypt, for example, composed solely of writing. And here's a 14th century Mamluk Quran, produced either in Syria or Egypt, with stunningly beautiful calligraphy. Neither includes figural imagery. Sometimes medieval Jews and Muslims felt ambivalent about any sort of imagery. For example, a later Muslim reader of a Maqamat of Al-Hariri, produced in Baghdad around 1215 or 1235, decided to put a black line through the necks of all the figures in order to symbolically decapitate them. Similarly, a later owner of this double frontispiece of a Persian manuscript painted a thin red line carefully through the neck of each person and even slaughtered the animal because he felt discomfort with images of living creatures. A Kashan luster tile from the tomb of Sheikh Abd al-Samad at Natanz in central Iran, made by and for Muslims, originally formed part of a frieze with a quotation from the Quran. Later, an iconoclast who did not share their views chipped away at the heads of all the birds to render them inanimate. Medieval Jews were also ambivalent about images of living creatures. At times, they covered their face with hair as in this Adam and Eve in a German 13th century Bible, or had the figure turned away from the viewer, as in this mural showing at the right the binding of Isaac in the 3rd century synagogue at Dura Europas. Perhaps the most famous Jewish example is the adoption of griffin heads for human figures in the bird's head Haggadah, produced around 1300 in southern Germany. This version of Rashi's commentary on the Bible, commissioned in 1233 in Würzburg, was illuminated by a Christian who misunderstood Jewish attitudes towards art. After it was made, the Jewish owner had the facial features of all the figures removed, as well as the entire figure of God, who would have appeared in the semicircle at the top of the composition, as he does in innumerable Christian images. This Jewish book, like so many Muslim ones, communicates the sacred nature of God, not through figural imagery, but rather through the highly ornamented word, which in this case means, and God spoke. These examples show that both Jews and Muslims appreciated the value of art and retained as much of the illuminations in their interpretation of their religion allowed. Since both Judaism and Islam are Abrahamic faiths, shared subjects are another way in which their visual culture was similar. In Jewish art, Abraham is shown ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, as here at Dura Europas, and in a Hispano-Moresque Haggadah, dated around 1300. Muslim illuminations also show this scene, although Muslims identify the son as Ishmael, not Isaac. The earliest known example of this theme appears in the anthology of Iskandar Sultan, produced in Shiraz in 1410 or 1411. The basic elements are Abraham, his son, the ram, and a divine sign, whether the angel or hand of God, appear in both Jewish and Muslim images. Another subject that appears in both Muslim and Jewish manuscripts is the finding of Moses. In a world history written by Rashid al-Din and made during his lifetime around 1310, Musa, that is Moses, is about to be retrieved by women from the emperor's household, perhaps including the pharaoh's wife, who in the Islamic tradition rescues the baby. As the infant rushes through the water in a box, the women await him, their outer clothes hanging from a tree to keep dry. Similarly, in a contemporary Jewish example from the Golden Haggadah, a northern Spanish manuscript dated around 1320, Miriam is seated at the upper right, while below in the water are 3 nude women, one of whom opens the lid of the box to reveal the infant, Moses in swaddling clothes. Jews living in Islamic lands produced art that is especially close to that of their Muslim neighbors. For example, just as the Muslim manuscripts included decorative signs known as carpet pages, which include aniconic design elements, geometric and foliate borders, floral motifs, and palmettes, so did their Jewish counterparts. Here, a folio from a 9th century Quran shows a liberal use of gold to illuminate a geometric design of great beauty and complexity, a rectangular frame filled in part with circles. Quite similar in principle is the carpet page in a 10th century book of Exodus, written in Arabic characters for Karaites, that is, Jews who rejected early rabbinical commentaries and opinions and instead held that the Bible was the only true source of religious law. Once again, the carpet page shows a rectangular frame that surrounds circles. And once again, at the left, a beautiful roundel with leafy design protrudes from the edge of the main rectangular shape. Style has meaning. It's not simply an aesthetic choice. The style of late 17th century version of Shane's Ardashir Nama, for example, makes clear that the Jewish patron identified as both Jewish and Persian. This should not be surprising, since Jews had lived in Persia since the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. Written around the year 1330, the Ardashir Nama recounts the ancient story of Esther, the Jewish queen of Persia who saved her people. The language of the text is Judeo-Persian, that is, Persian written in Hebrew letters, and its literary form is also Persian, since Shirin recasts the tale in the genre of a Persian epic. The illuminations show large swaying figures who wear elegant clothes, like the finest 17th century court art. But they lack the gracefulness and sophistication of that art. The Jewish manuscript was produced in Isfahan, but not in a prestigious workshop. Like Persian art for Muslims, the images of the Ardashir Nama often expand into the margins or the text column, as we see in this illumination showing Shiru, son of Ardashir and Vashti, meeting the Chinese princess Mazad in her garden. Although like Persian illuminations, the setting of the illuminations are lively and detailed. Through its pictorial and textual style, this manuscript reveals how strongly 17th century Jews in Isfahan felt about their Persian identity. Armenians living in Isfahan at the time, by contrast, adopted a European style for their art. I would like to conclude with a medieval picture Bible that the Pope gave Shah Abbas I in 1608. The Shah ordered a set of summaries to be added in Persian, and another set was inscribed in Judeo-Persian. Clearly, Jews had access to this highly prized manuscript that was produced by Christians and given as a gift to a Muslim. From the 9th until the mid-17th century, Jews in Islamic lands experienced a golden age in terms of cooperation and tolerance. Although the news today focuses on conflicts among Christians, Muslims, and Jews, a study of the art of the past shows numerous instances of peaceful coexistence and shared culture. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Wolfthal and to Elish for reading and presenting the paper. It's now my turn to present my paper. So I'm Farshid Emami. I'm an assistant professor of Islamic art history at Rice University. And now I'll go ahead and, so my presentation is titled Multicultural Architecture, Muslim Artisans, and the Palace Church of Medieval Palermo, Sicily. Today, when many people think about the relationship among Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the medieval period, they imagine an era characterized by war, enmity, and conflict. Yet there were many instances where a spirit of tolerance and coexistence defined the relationship among these faith groups. And these moments of multiculturalism are primarily manifest in art and architecture. In my presentation, I will focus on one such context, the city of Palermo in the southern Italian island of Sicily, and will particularly look at the Cappella Palatina, or Palace Chapel, a church built in the 12th century in Palermo. Medieval Sicily was situated at the crossroads of commercial and cultural interactions. It occupied the liminal cultural zone between the Muslim-ruled areas in the south and the Christian-dominated lands in the north of the Mediterranean Sea. During the 9th century, Sicily, which was governed by the Byzantine Empire, was conquered by an army of Berber and Arab troops from North Africa. Muslim rule in Sicily lasted for more than 2 centuries, during which the Chaldeans partly governed as vassals of the mighty Fatimid Empire in North Africa. The chief city of Sicily was Palermo, which became a thriving center of commerce and culture. Travelers describe Palermo as a bustling metropolis with well-stocked markets and frequented by merchants of various origins. Very little has survived from the art and architecture of Sicily during the period of Muslim rule. One interesting remnant is a column inscribed with verses from the Quran, which likely belonged to Palermo's congregational mosque and was later incorporated into the city's cathedral. The Normans terminated the Muslim rule in Sicily. Beginning in 1060, the Normans embarked on a series of conquests in Europe. These conquests were initially destructive, but after the accession of Roger II and the foundation of the so-called New Kingdom of Sicily in 1130, the island saw an era of cultural flowering. Roger II and his immediate successors sponsored the material and visual culture that was deliberately hybrid and syncretic. Roger II ruled over a multilingual community composed of people who spoke three main languages: Latin, Greek, and Arabic. Hence, coins and royal decrees were often issued in multiple languages. This well-known funerary tablet, for instance, include texts in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Judeo-Arabic, which is Hebrew written in Arabic script. Another manifestation of the multicultural context of Norman Sicily is the famous world map that was prepared by the Arab geographer El-Idrisi, who was patronized by the Norman king Roger II. The coronation mantle of Roger II also reflects the multicultural ambience of the island, made of red silk embroidered with thousands of pearls. The mantle is decorated with an Islamic style motif, a palm tree flanked by mirror images of a lion subduing a camel, and bears an Arabic inscription which states that it was, quote, produced in the capital city of Sicily at the royal workshop. Arabic-speaking artisans had continued to work in the textile workshop and under Roger II. A similar dialogue with Islamic culture can be seen in the architecture of Norman Sicily. In the 12th century, a ring of pleasure gardens was constructed around Palermo, which was likely referred to as earthly paradise. Overlooking a garden on a sloping ground, the Lazisa Palace was commissioned in 1165 and functioned as a summertime palace. The name of the palace comes from the Arabic term al-aziz, meaning dear or splendid. The fountain hall of the Lazisa Palace incorporates elements of Islamic architecture, such as a stream that juts off the back wall, flows on a carved slab, and runs in shallow channels and basins in the middle of the hall. A common feature of Islamic palaces and gardens, this form of fountain accelerates the evaporation of water, cooling the air, and creating a pleasant climatic condition in the summer. The Cappella Palatina is the most stunning architectural manifestation of the multicultural policy that was pursued in Sicily by Norman kings. It is a lavishly decorated church that was erected within the Norman royal compound in Palermo. On entering the chapel, one's gaze is drawn to an intricately carved and richly ornamented wooden ceiling that covers the central zone of three-aisled hall that precedes the sanctuary. The ceiling consists of two parallel rows of 10 pointed stars surrounded by cell-like niches that are stacked on top of one another and cascade down like a stalactite vaulting. This form of vaulting with cell-like niches, which resembles honeycombs, is known as mokarnas. It was a ubiquitous element of Islamic architecture from Central Asia to Iberia. Like other mokarnas ceilings, the wooden roof of Cappella Palatina is constructed according to a sophisticated geometric scheme. Mokarnas decoration can be found in North Africa, for instance, in the Mosque of Al-Akmar in Fatimid Cairo. But these mokarnas decorations are all made of brick or stone. Indeed, no wooden mokarnas ceiling comparable to that of the Cappella Palatina is extant today. The unique work of Muslim craftspersons has survived in a Christian church. But it is not just the geometry of the ceiling and its mokarnas decoration that makes it particularly remarkable. The ceiling of the church is also decorated with hundreds of paintings in Arabic inscriptions that state well wishes for the Norman ruler. The paintings depict a variety of subjects, including rulers and their boon companions, musicians, lions and other animals, horsemen and wrestlers. Most of the figural scenes are derived from what is called traditional Islamic palatial cycle. Parallels for these figural paintings can be found, for instance, in the remnants of the Fatimid Palace in Cairo. Here we see musicians and scenes of hunting, and these are examples of the princely cycle, the so-called Islamic princely cycle that was common in Islamic palaces. Yet a small number of paintings in Cappella Palatina also show an engagement with Christian sources and were presumably commissioned by the Norman kings. Some depict Christian saints. Others illustrate biblical figures such as King David, whose stories were known to Muslim artisans from the Quran and other Islamic sources. The form and decoration of the wooden ceiling of the Cappella Palatina clearly indicates that it was made by Muslim artists, though the precise origin of the artists remains unclear. The meaning of the paintings has also been a puzzle for art historians. Why would a Christian king commission a ceiling with secular Muslim imagery in this church? Some scholars have suggested that the western part of the chapel, which is surmounted by this ceiling, was not intended for the performance of religious service alone, but was rather used as a royal audience hall, where Roger II would be seated on the throne. According to this view, the building had a royal function, hence the inclusion of imagery drawn from Muslim palaces would have been appropriate. Some scholars have argued that the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina can be seen as, quote, a metaphor for religious tolerance. Others argue that it represents a form of cultural appropriation. In any event, there is consensus that the syncretic visual language of the Cappella Palatina sprang from a deliberate policy of multiculturalism. It employs the artistic styles dominant around the Mediterranean basin to construct a cosmopolitan image for the Norman kingdom. Whatever the political intentions may have been, the policy is remarkable, especially if we compare it with some of the dominant political approaches in the present day. The Cappella Palatina stands as a work of architecture, as a stunning work of architecture, because it drew on the resources and talents of more than one culture. Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Professor Azra Aksamija. Dr. Aksamija is an artist and architectural historian. She's an associate professor in the MIT Department of Architecture program in Art, Culture, and Technology, where she directs the Future Heritage Lab. Her work explores how social life is affected by cultural biases and by the cultural destruction within the context of conflict, migration, and forced displacement. She received the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2013 for her design of the prayer space in the Islamic cemetery Altach, Austria, and her work is currently on view at the 17th Architecture Biennale in Venice, Italy.
Thank you so much, Farshid, for the introduction, and hello to everyone watching us from afar. Nice to be with you, at least digitally, and it's my pleasure to be part of this wonderful panel. It was very inspiring for me, and I come to you today to present from the perspective of a contemporary designer and to see how we can take these lessons from the past to inform the building of architecture of coexistence at present, especially at the moment that is so politicized and can be hostile at parts. I will do that through the lens of the project which I had the pleasure to be part of, the Islamic cemetery in Altach in Austria, the westernmost part of Austria. The cemetery was designed by the Austrian architect Bernardo Bader, completed in 2012, and he invited me to be the artist, like with a percentage for the art program, to design a Qibla wall in the mosque area of this project. But before I get into the project, I just want to introduce briefly the context in which this project took place to bring you to its significance. Austria is a country where Islam has been recognized as a religion equal to Christianity and Judaism since more than 100 years. However, every time new mosque is about to be built or any kind of Islamic edifice, there are protests, there is a huge political debate, kind of xenophobic sentiment packaged into architectural arguments. And you see one example of that quote I brought from Austrian politician Hans Christian Strache, who at one of the protests he organized with the initiative called Cities Against Islamization, said that today I did not seem to be in Europe, but rather in Kabul or Antwerpistan, looking at a mosque that was to be built in Antwerp. So protests like this communicate as if Islam is a religion that is alien to Europe, and the Muslims with their buildings are not belonging to that region. However, historically, of course, such claims cannot be sustained. We just need to look into the history of the long Islamic tradition in Europe. For example, I mean, we saw in Farshid's presentation, but also with Sheref Ali Jami in Edirne, for example, or Mesquita Cathedral, Mosque Cathedral in Cordoba, and so on. So one side, this argument today is in the contemporary architectural design is, this kind of fear of the others and a kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric that is packaged into architectural debates. But then within architectural debates, there is a strong dilemma between how one should be building for Muslims in countries where Muslims are not a majority or where there is no longer standing tradition. What kinds of inspiration does one draw upon, especially for communities where you have people migrating to a region and they come from very different cultural backgrounds. So one predominant trend in architecture is to build by being inspired from grand periods in Islamic history. For example, for many Turkish migrants, it is looking at the precedent of the famous buildings from the Ottoman Empire. And on the other hand, the architects seem to be preferring more kind of modernist tradition, have a polished, clean, cutting edge shapes in which then one works with ornament to signal the identity of the users within. And there's the kind of stylistic dilemma today. But I would like to argue that this type of dilemma kind of is quite reductive and puts us in sheds away from the very rich formal repertoire that we know from Islamic history. So in the cemetery of Altach in Austria, the architect was facing similar challenges, but another challenge was how to build for a community of people who come from Turkey, Chechnya, Bosnia, countries that have different traditions. And it's the third generation of people living in Austria now, which starting to shift their idea of where do they actually feel at home. So what is significant about this project is it is the first cemetery for Muslims in this part of the country, the second one in Austria. Up to this point, it was not possible for Muslims to be buried according to Islamic rite. When someone would die, the descendants would send the body, the corpse, to the countries of origin, which was connected to very big expenses and logistical problems. This was, so to say, solved with this facility. But the problem was also emotional. A lot of people, even though when they have the possibility to be buried according to Islamic rite, they don't feel at home. And what was unique here was that this community said, no, Austria has become the place where you want to bury your dead and to find a place of final resting. This is something that was communicated at the very opening of the the cemetery by Dr. Fuad Sanat, who was at that time president of the Islamic community, saying that homeland is the place where we would like to find the final resting. In the immigration politics in Austria, this is quite a big move, meaning that people who have arrived as these temporary guest workers from Turkey in the 60s and 70s, Chechnya in the 80s, and in the 90s from Yugoslavia, now think that this is their new homeland. But what does that actually mean? And how does one build for this hybrid place where you are feeling at home in different parts of the world? So that needed to be negotiated with everyone. And what was very unique here again was that there was no precedent, and there was also no community that was centrally organized. There are all these scattered groups scattered around 95 municipalities. What was interesting that there was this one NGO organization called OK Zusammenleben, OK Living Together, that initiated the project. They hired the Islamic expert within the Catholic Church to produce a document that would make a point that an Islamic cemetery is actually needed in Austria, and what does that burial look like that could be then presented to the Austrian government to make a claim to fund this project. The other part was that finding burial ground was difficult, and also finding another kind of political mediation within this very hostile political environment in Austria, or like Islamophobic, let's say, environment. So here, the Jewish Museum played an important role, and here you see former director of the Jewish Museum. All the Jews from this region have been either killed or expelled during the Second World War, and they made a very strong argument for the importance of feeling at home, and supported the wayfinding of, no one wants to give you basically a piece of land to build as a Muslim community. So a piece of land was found next to the Jewish cemetery in this little town, Altach. And here you see representatives of different Islamic communities. So that was a point where architecture functions as a form of community making, because there were no organizational structures. There were all these scattered little jamaats. Finding decisions and making decisions together and applying for funding and so on required the crystallization of organizational structures for Muslim communities, which then happened through this joint project. The other important point, and where architecture works as a vehicle to connect people, is through the aspect of design and really the transcultural aesthetic. And you see here, one is this negotiation of the architectural piece in the landscape. Here, the architect, who is quite amazing and such a sensible person, worked, just like with the smell of the wood and the kind of colors of this painting of the concrete to match it and to fit into the landscape. Certain hybrid forms, this is something that doesn't really exist in the Islamic burials. It's kind of display stone where then the community could gather, because people are coming from all the different parts of the region together and to kind of have a prayer before the burial. And then, educating and kind of merging traditions through craftsmanship. Here, the architect worked with local craftsmen who really were excited about, the challenge of building Islamic ornaments with the local Austrian woodcraft. And here, the region is very famous for its fir wood craftsmanship, like also crafting without any nails. And so there was a kind of mutual learning process here, working between religious leaders and people educated in Islamic art and architecture, and then local craftsmen. And then I was commissioned to design the symbolic parts of the prayer space, which is also not needed, but the architects and the community found it important to have something that will be a mosque, but not called a mosque, to avoid the political difficulties around the project. So I created this Qibla wall, which is inspired by mihrabs of contemporary Islamic architecture, where mihrab is not just a niche, but it's actually fully dissolved into light, like in the Mosque of Grand National Assembly in Ankara, but also working with local materials like the wooden shingles that you find all around this part of Austria. And here we are moving away from this cube or dome and minarets, yes and no debate, from the kind of iconographic discussion into the sensory experience of space, of light that is staged through the shingles hung on the stainless steel curtain that display the words Muhammad and Allah, and that kind of merge the person and animate the space in the moment of devotion, but also merge the person praying inside with the landscape of the outside, which is really the meaning of the mihrab, a gateway to the world after, the place that's neither inside nor outside, and that's negotiating that kind of inside-outside relationship. And so for this bringing together of these 9 communities from 95 different municipalities, Muslims, non-Muslims, Catholic community, Jewish museum, working together on this project was made a huge impact on the project. There was almost no negative media backlash. And there are thousands and thousands of people who came to the opening and also continue coming. The mayor here is very proud, kind of explaining the project to the visitors. It's become a tourist attraction also because it got the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Among many other architectural awards in a non-Muslim context. And it shows you that this kind of, when we move to the human scale, where we are moved as humans through experience of light and space and smell and good craftsmanship, we can also connect as human beings across any kind of border. Thank you.
Thank you, Azra, for the wonderful presentation. Start with a broader question, and this is, we both have, we looked at the past, art and architecture of the past, but also the present. So I wanted to start with this question for Azra. What are the, you talked about learning from the past. What understanding of the past, or how can we approach the past to enrich the present? Obviously, we don't want to romanticize the coexistence that existed in the medieval period, because there were periods of conflict as well as periods of peace and coexistence. So what are the, as a contemporary artist, I was wondering, what are the main elements of, what are the main features of the past that stand out to you, and what are the, what kind of understanding of the past is most useful for cultivating convergence or cross-cultural understanding, interfaith dialogue in the present moment?
It's quite a difficult but strong question, but I think maybe the core here is the conception of culture and the idea that, we often think like, oh, I'm Muslim or I'm Christian. What does that actually mean? And I think when we look at our different presentations and this, as Professor Markos, this like visual language to express the stories of the faith, right? That's how you phrased it. That language has always been hybrid. There is no pure culture as such. That every religious group has been building on what was there before it. So there is always this dialogical dimension that one faith comes in a region, there's stuff there, people learn from it. They may destroy it, but they'll also use the same craftsmen, and so things influence each other. And so this whole idea of like a purity of culture is a false one, and that conception feeds into contemporary debates on multiculturalism or interculturalism. I'm in the favor of the word transculturalism, for that idea that there's not this culture and that culture, and they interact or multiply each other, but everything is transcultural and hybrid, right? And I think that conception brings us to an understanding that I'm a hybrid, you are a hybrid, and I can be more elastic. And when I realize that all of our identities are multidimensional, hybrid, and fluid, and they're constantly changing. And in the end, everyone is talking about the same things, the existential question of why am I here and how do I relate to these other, to God and to divinity, and how do I express that?
It is interesting because, for instance, as I showed you, you've got figural art both in the East and in the West. But when you look at some of the icons I showed you, in one way, even though East and West are both figural, in many ways, Eastern iconography looks more like Jewish or Muslim art than any of them look like Western art, Western Catholic art. And yet, in the same time, when you speak culturally, again, I'm at Houston Baptist University, even though Baptist is part of the West, Baptists really love to put word over image. And in that sense, Baptists are a little bit more like Muslims than they are like Catholics. So it is interesting to see that crossover. And again, to find, Azra, have you been to Houston to see the Rothko Chapel? That's another attempt.
Yeah,
I think you would love it because it's another attempt to speak interfaith and to basically to present a sacred space. And there's a fascinating story that a lot of you know that the Russians were trying to decide what faith to adopt, whether it would be Muslim, Jewish, whether it would be Orthodox or Catholic or whatnot. And the story was that they sent their people all around looking at places. And when they came back, they chose the Orthodox faith because when they went to Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, they said, we felt like we had been raptured up into heaven. And so again, the need for sacred space, especially in our modern industrialized age, is very, very important. And a lot of times a Christian might feel a sense of peace in a mosque as opposed to a modern industrialized society. And so we do very much need sacred space, especially in our inner cities.
There's one question here. It says, the quote from Exodus, "You shall not make for yourself an image." Is it plausible that an image can be made for others, or am I being too pedantic? So I think we could ask if there are any workshops, perhaps, that are working to produce images for religions that are iconoclast or iconoclastic.
I will say just one way to answer that. Again, if you look at John of Damascus and look at the Orthodox tradition of images, they always make a very strong distinction between worshiping the images and venerating the images. So they will use that word, they venerate the icon. In fact, they'll usually kiss it, light a candle or something. But they want to show that there's a difference between venerating and participating and actually worshiping the image. But I'm wondering if this person is also asking, let's say you're a Muslim that doesn't believe in figural art for yourself. Would it be okay for you to be hired by a Christian to make a figural art for someone else? I think that's part of the question. And I don't know if Farshid has an answer or anybody has an answer to that one. Would you be allowed to do something, even if it's not part of your faith tradition, for someone else?
Another point to highlight is even within these faith communities, Christianity, you talked about baptism, Orthodox Christianity, even within Islam, there are different views and different approaches. And there's no monolithic approach to the issue of figural representation is obviously more sensitive in Islam. But so what we see is that figural representations of living beings are avoided in sacred spaces, meaning mosques and madrasas and other religious contexts generally, although there are very few exceptions, and in sacred texts, meaning that the Quran was never illustrated. But that doesn't mean that Muslims did not produce secular, religious representations of religious figures in non-religious contexts, which is a little paradoxical, meaning that in the history, Rashid ad-Din's history, there are representations of biblical Prophet Muhammad, but this is not a book, this is not a sacred book, this is a book of history. So that doesn't mean that the person who produced that image is not Muslim. He is Muslim and he would avoid figural representation in a place of worship, but it was fine for that particular person to produce that image of a holy figure in in a book that is not meant to be a sacred book, that is not the scripture or the sacred text. So there are lots of nuances around the issue, even in Islamic context. It's not just a sectarian issue within Islam, or Shia or Sunni. You see, different approaches in different contexts and in different time, across time and space.
By the way, if you go on Amazon and search, you'll find that there's been a real surge in Christian circles in calligraphy. And you can not only buy beautiful Bibles that have something from the Psalms, let's say, in calligraphy, but you can even buy ones where you can do it and then color it. But there seems to be a new love, a revival, maybe more evangelicals, but I've seen all Christians that are very interested in this idea of taking the word and the shapes of the letters themselves and turn them into something beautiful.
Yeah, I find coming back to the time of the present, and for me, it's all this work that I'm doing is inspired by my upbringing in Bosnia, which has been a place where historically Muslims, Jews, Christians have lived together. And, it was not always a peaceful coexistence, but it was quite fertile one. And we have in the south of the country mosques whose minarets look like church towers because they were built by Christian masons, just like hired those guys. They were building what they were always building, and these were like square-based minarets, right? And but then Christians really liked carpets in his mosque, so they started carpeting their churches too. So the whole thing is becoming this quite hybrid place. And I think when you strip religions from their political dimensions, and when it comes to this really spiritual and human scale of a kind of community building and people helping people and coming to a place of hope and inspiration, that's where that fruitful dialogue and inspiration can happen. And I think one can learn that and bring it maybe into politics too. And this is the same thing that works against xenophobia. People who are xenophobic, usually they'll be really nice also, and to someone who in abstract terms they may be talking badly about, but when it comes to helping a human being on the street, they would, right? And so I think that dimension, like stripping down these abstract terms of institutions, religious, ethnic identities to like human beings, allows you to connect and to see beyond prejudices and make you more empathetic.
There's one question. Is there anything to be said about monotheism?
I will say, as a Greek, the Greeks and Turks have been fighting for a long time, like the Jews and Arabs, but one of the reasons they fight is it's like sibling rivalry, since they're so much like each other. It's kind of crazy. But real quickly, the other one about monotheism. I mean, if you believe in monotheism, you believe in one God who is outside of time and space, who created the earth and everything in the earth. And if you believe in a God who is a creator, right? In all mythology, God comes out of matter, whether it's Greek or Roman, Egyptian, whatever, Norse, matter always starts and God comes out of the matter. But monotheism says God is one and he's outside and he creates. And so that means that when we look at nature, when we look at creation, we will see order. And I think anybody that is a monotheist is going to have a natural love of order and balance and harmony and rhythm. And we'll look to see that in our language and our prayers, but also in our art. And it doesn't make a difference what genre of art it is. We're finding in there some kind of form. And it's kind of funny because if you look at Jackson Pollock with his drippings, in one sense, they seem absolutely random. And yet at the same time, they are incredibly formal, like the images behind Azra, her picture and what she made there. There is, it may seem random, but there is a much deeper order that's here, and it's in the word and it's in the art at the same time. So I think that's something that all the Abrahamic faiths have in common.
Persian, Egyptian, Christian, Islam. I mean, in the field of Islamic art and architecture, there's a really interesting discussion on what actually constitutes Islamic art and architecture. Is business tower in Kuwait Islamic art? You know, I mean, is it Kuwaiti art? How do we go about this? And is it something characterized by faith or the region of the Islamic world? And what the kind of art and architecture that has no religious content, but comes maybe out of that tradition. So these are really complicated questions and have to do, at least in that field, with the, you know, the kind of evolution of the field that comes out of the Western art history and the kind of also colonial period, and the exoticization of the Orient and the Islamic world. But of course, there is such thing as Islamic art. I mean, I showed you today something. It has Islamic content and it's built by and for Muslims. So that could be one type of naming. So I think the Persian, Egyptian, regional categorization can be helpful, especially when we want to kind of have a crossover and to show a multifaceted dimension of art and not just focus on one religious group. But there is a baggage that comes with that too. Like in the case of the Islamic art, you have an entire part of the world being characterized as Islamic, and you have non-Muslims living there and non-Islamic art, and it's all being labeled with this religious label. So it's complicated.
If I may also add, right, I mean, regional characteristics are definitely there. There's something Egyptian about an Egyptian mosque, definitely, that is not necessarily Islamic, and but all these categorizations have their own limits and benefits. I think, and it's, as Azra said, it's an ongoing debate. There are lots of issues surrounding it. There is the historiographic issues, colonial period, and it's an ongoing debate. But it's important to be, I think, personally be aware of the limitations of each of them and its benefits of each categorization. So like ethnic or regional categories might lead us to nationalism. Maybe it's sometimes unintentionally, but Islamic may seem to suggest that everything is determined by religion, which no, was not the case. Not everything is determined by religion, and there is huge diversity even in religious practices. So I wish there was a world in which there were no categories, but we cannot do away with categories. They do exist, and it's important to be just aware of their benefits and limitations.
So there is a question about calligraphy, which is it considered performing art or not? And I think Professor Emami, we read this in one of your classes, Rock's paper on calligraphy and how the centrist and the central in calligraphy. So I remember that fondly. That was a very good paper to read about this. But and then there's another question specific for Azra. Was the direction of the east a significant part of Azra's design? Can you say anything about the use of light so we can answer these questions?
The determination of the sprayer space was determined through the direction of Mecca. So the architect worked with, I guess it's geographer or what is determining. They were on site and measuring the directions and worked also with Jamaat to kind of determine the direction of Mecca. So that's how the whole prayer space is oriented and where the light is coming in. But the light was very important for the design of the place. Light is one of the 99 names of God in Islam. As God cannot be described, there are 99 names indicating the infinity of possibilities to name the humongous and how do you say, not describable nature of the divine, let's say. And so light and that experience is really important in Islamic tradition. And that's what I wanted the visitor to experience. You come in and you are, surrounded by light, but how do you experience it? So breaking it and staging it and choreographing it through that curtain was a vehicle to do that. And because the prayer times in Islam are determined by light, by the position of sun in the sky and during the length of the shadow. Let's say if you are in the desert and you don't know what is the time, you can use a stick or your own bodily shadow to determine what is the prayer time. This gives you orientation in time and space. And so that experience is also transported into the design. You see, as the light is coming in through that mihrab window, you see the shadows of that calligraphy on the ground, and it's changing the direction depending on the time of the day. And then, of course, the person praying inside is merging with that light, so they become, so to say, one with God. So there are all these symbolic narratives. But what was kind of interesting was the negotiation of calligraphy, because I, suggested we should use Allah and Muhammad, but there are different groups in Islamic groups in the region. For example, the Alevis, who just wanted to have Allah and not Muhammad, because for them Ali is the other prophet who is the important figure. So there was whole negotiation within the community. Can we also have Ali, or shall it be also Muhammad, or shall it be all three? And so the Sunni majority won their stake, and it was then decided it should be Allah and Muhammad. But that was, again, talking about diversity, right? Interesting negotiation to have in the kind of calligraphic sequence, and you see some of them in my background image.
Many people know that the big difference between Romanesque cathedrals and Gothic cathedrals is when we get to Gothic cathedrals and they figure out how to use those flying buttresses and take some of the weight off of it, that's when they were able to expand the stained glass windows monumentally. And what that allowed was much more light into the sacred space. And light, too, of course, is important. In him was life, and that life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot defeat it, right? So this idea of light is life-giving. We've got a great artist over at Houston Baptist University called Michael Collins, and he paints with light. If you ever get to see his thick Van Gogh kind of paintings, they're just saturated with light, because light is part of the mystery of God. And, the whole thing about whether it's a wave or a particle and everything else is quite amazing, and brings in a dimension of physics and whatnot into art itself. So yeah, nothing like the light in a Gothic cathedral.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and to the co-panelists. Thanks so much.